Hello, Internet. Gino, that Pinguino Greco, here again with another episode of Deep Listens. And today is our episode on Little Nightmares, the scary, spooky game. Spooky. About a small child trying to escape from a horrible place. But before we get to the spooky game, I am joined, as always, by Billy, the mushroom face, Rothert.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I have often been described as a fun guy, but never really been referred to as a fun guy. I'm really happy to be talking about this game. In general, I had a little bit lower expectations and was pleasantly surprised. I can't wait to talk about some of the cool things that Little Nightmares does.
And we are also joined, as always, by Peter Longarm Busby.
Nice. I'll take that one. That guy's creepy. Hey, everybody. This, as we said, is a spooky game, so appropriate for a spooky St. Patrick's Day. So hopefully everybody enjoys it. This week's animal fact. So I actually looked up a lot of super cool facts about pigeons. So I encourage you to do a little pigeon research on your own, but I did not fact check all of them. So I'll only give you one that I actually did fact check. So this is from an article in Current Biology. It's a little old, but I assume it's still true. The title of the article is Pigeon Homing Along Highways and Exits. So it should give you a general idea of what I'm going to tell you right now. But apparently when pigeons are navigating, they use basically what I'll call human landmarks. They follow large roads, take exits, do a lot of cool sort of navigational stuff, following along with sort of, the stuff we've built to navigate ourselves. So just a cool fact about pigeons and how they get around.
Huh.
Yeah.
I learned some fun facts about the most dangerous animal of all, humans.
Ooh.
Want to know some mummy facts?
I'd love to know some mummy facts. Suitable for our spooky podcast.
For our spooky podcast. Fun fact about mummies. So during the early 1900s and late 1800s, Europeans had gone to Egypt and had begun trading with Egyptians. And one of their resources that they had a lot of was mummies, because tomb robbers would go in there and just grab mummies because they didn't care. And so the Europeans, or at least the British, used mummies as pieces of just normal everyday stuff that you could use. So like a resource. So one of the very popular colors of paint is mummy brown. And the reason why it is mummy brown is because it has bits of mummy in it.
I mean, that's a good name, I guess.
It was a really popular shade of brown.
Sure.
And it turns out decaying human flesh was the key ingredient.
Vibrant.
And they were also used for fertilizer.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
So
sure.
you could buy
disposable resource.
You could use decaying human flesh to make your painting very good, or you could use it to make your garden grow.
I just feel like I'm kind of surprised that there were enough mummies for there to be a market.
Yeah, turns out.
Can I jump in on this one as well?
Yeah.
So, Gino, great mummy facts. There are another thing that mummies were used for as well. So, a book came out back in 2012, Medicinal Cannibalism in Early Modern English Literature and Culture. And another book, too. I won't read all the titles of these books, but together they reveal, this is from a Smithsonian article, the gruesome history of eating corpses as medicine. For several hundred years, peaking in the 16th and 17th centuries, many Europeans, including royalty, priests, and scientists, routinely ingested remedies containing human bones, blood, and fat as medicine for everything from headaches to epilepsy. And one of the things they would use, mummies stolen from Egyptian tombs.
I know that mummies were a thing, but I never knew that there were enough of them. I thought that only the top. I thought mummies were a 1% thing. Only the coolest people could be mummified.
Yeah, it started out that way, but as Egyptian society rolled on, there were more and more mummies. People, lower and lower levels of people. And also there were some, emperors who demanded to be mummified with all of their servants. And so there were a lot of less cool people.
Right, like you just got to ride and die with the squad.
Yeah, man.
Yes. It was all good until the end.
How much mummy do you really need to eat to cure a headache? You know, I bet it's not like a full arm or something. It sounds like they would powder it and like grind it up.
I think it'd be way funnier if they were just like, finish your plate.
Do you want
to
eat this leg?
It's like antibiotics. You can't like stop taking it once you feel better. You got to like finish the whole calf. Like,
finish your plate, sir.
That shit was hardcore. And you know what? Cannibalism. We got a segue now.
Yep. So speaking of cannibalism, well, before we start speaking of cannibalism and Little Nightmares, we can also speak of other horrible things, like people reaching out to us on the internet and providing us with feedback. So if you want to get in touch with the show, you can do so at DeepListensPod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. You can hit up our comment sections and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. And we also have our fundraising for the Giant Bomb Community Endurance Run now officially open. You can find it at fundraise.pencilsofpromise.org/GBCER8. And, of course, we use the Roman numeral. So GBCER VIII. We don't have every single member of our team currently joined, so donating to individual people is a little bit tricky unless you want to donate to Jeff Rudd. But we will get all of that stuff straightened out pretty quickly. If you want to start donating to just the team and we can start parsing it, feel free to do so. We will, of course, honor our Deep Listens pledge that we made last week. If you want to donate and then suggest a game that we should play, if you have the largest donation, we will then pick that game and we will play it on a future episode. So go ahead and donate and help out. It's for a good cause. Pencils of Promise raises money to help kids go to school in developing nations. So it's a good cause. So without further ado, here's some of our feedback. Angel reaches out to us again, and as is his way, he's concerned about some of the things we've been doing for the GBCER, and he says, was Chris drunk on this podcast? I'm not trying to be rude, but he seemed to be slurring his words during his bit, just trying to share a possible concern. Also, can Gino please ban food donation incentives? They always make people miserable for not enough money. So first, ZP did sound a little drunk on our podcast last week, and the reason for that was he is recovering from a car accident, and he was on doctor-prescribed muscle relaxants. So he was not drunk. That was just his ability to make coherent sentences being impaired by muscle relaxants.
He was medically turned.
Yes.
But as far as we know, he did not have to ingest any mummy.
No.
For medicinal purposes.
No.
To the best of our knowledge.
It would have been better if he could, but
I mean,
we can't do that stuff anymore.
It's too expensive. Health insurance only covers so much. And then food donation incentives, we've talked about it as a group. I've talked with some of the other runners. We are not having any sort of food donation incentive that will make anyone sick. Nikki will be still eating a blood sausage, I believe, but that is because he wants to eat a blood sausage. I will do my best to stop ZP from eating Vienna sausages. I have told him every time he's eaten them not to. But alas, I am not physically in his presence, so I cannot slap the Vienna sausage out of his hand. He's an adult. I can't stop him from hurting himself. I can only discourage it. That's all I can do. But thank you for voicing your concerns. There will be no food challenges. If anything, I might make him eat a salad, like a nice salad.
Yeah, I think we should just pull together a couple of little donation bits here and there and say ZP, there's X number of dollars here waiting for you if you eat a damn vegetable.
Fun fact: he is actually vegetarian for a little while as he's recovering from his head injury. Because doctors are actually, it will be better for you and your recovery if you cut meat out of your diet, which just goes to show, fuck meat.
So while I'm digesting this perfectly done steak that I had before the podcast started, let's talk about Little Nightmares.
Oh, well, we've got another bit of feedback.
The next
second bit of feedback. Speaking of ZP, like a lunatic, he sent us a comment in our YouTube comments. Why? I don't know, but he says, when will I be free from Final Fantasy? Gino, please, could we record another torture chamber? I promise the game won't be entirely bullshit. P.S. Gino, this diet is bullshit. Plants are bullshit. They are the worst. I have to eat twice as much as I normally would, and nothing tastes like meat. I want to eat a steak. Very appropriate.
The voice of reason, honestly.
You know, I couldn't have made this up. I didn't even look at what his comment was. I just saw that it was the words of lunacy. But no, you won't be free, and yes, we'll eventually play another one of your terrible games. Though the last time, I'll just remind everyone, the last time he picked a game, it was Jade Empire. So.
Yeah, he did pick that, didn't he?
Yeah.
Well, I think he picked
He's
it
0 for
knowing
1.
exactly what we were getting ourselves into. And we don't need to talk about some of your picks, Gino, i.e. Charles Barkley, Shut Up and Jam Guy Den, and Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood, and Silent Hill 4: The Room, just to name a few.
Fair to say, though, Jade Empire, most racist game we've ever played?
Most racist? Probably not most offensive. I think Charles Barkley still takes that.
Yeah, yes. I would say yes,
Fair.
that is a good correction. So
But,
yes, we will eventually do
yes,
another ZP
Jade Empire,
episode.
most racist, for sure.
Okay.
And I think close second, most offensive, Saints Row the Third. Which is also a Gino game?
Yeah, it was.
You're not wrong.
So, I mean, I will say ZP has a 0% success rate for picking games, but sample size comes into play here.
Yep. I've had ups, I've had downs.
We all.
And with that, you can send feedback to the show, but we're going to start talking about Little Nightmares. Billy, what is Little Nightmares? What is Nightmare?
So when you think about Little Nightmares, if you haven't played the game already, you should think about it in the same kind of game family as a game like Limbo or Inside or any of these other really cool, like sort of indie-made puzzle, platformer, short and sweet little titles. Little Nightmares developed by Tarsier Studios. Not sure if I'm getting the pronunciation right. But the story opens up with a small girl who wears but a yellow raincoat and carries like a little Zippo lighter.
Yep.
She wakes up in the depths of this place. You don't know much about it the first time you start the game, but it seems to be some kind of dungeon, prison, industrial-looking location. And you're tasked with nothing but the implied idea of escape. The game doesn't actually tell you anything about it. You're just tasked with this implied notion of escape. Before you wake up in this place, you're given a brief vision of a spooky-looking lady with this like long black hair and appears to be some sort of woman. That's all you get. But you wake up and you start your little... What?
In a kimono.
Right, in a kimono. She appears to be some sort of geisha or like head house mistress or something like that. So we start our adventure, and the game takes place across 4 chapters. We learn that this girl's name, 4 or 5 chapters. I can't remember if the last level is actually a chapter in and of itself, but there's 4 major worlds, and the character we learn later on in the game is named Six, or referred to simply as Six. She travels through a sort of this nightmare-scape of grand scale. Everything in the world seems to be bigger than her, or maybe in this case, she is just smaller than everything in the world. Enemies include environmental hazards, overly sized, grotesque-looking janitorial staff or cooks and cleaners and guests in this place. But the whole implied notion of escape takes place across these 4 levels that have these different thematic significances. One is a prison, one is a kitchen, the next is a I'm forgetting the exact order.
It's like a dining. Is the dining room then?
It's dining room, and then then it's the ladies' chambers. So you sort of progress along through these different layers, and you seem to be ascending. In general, going upwards the whole time, like to the surface. And
up and to the right.
Basically up and to the right, a la Thomas Was Alone. And
similar
as you go. As you keep going further and further and further, you get more and more detail about this world, this universe, and the character themselves gets a little more and more corrupted. We're going to talk about all those cool things as we break down some of the story components. That's the general idea, though, of Little Nightmares.
Yes. And so, Little Nightmares, what did you guys think when you first started? What was your first impression of the game?
I mean, the atmosphere just generally it's very vivid. I think the best way to describe it would be a nightmarish, Spirited Away sort of vibe. Sort of for reasons we'll get into just when we're talking about level design. But initially, I didn't necessarily think the platformer was going to be as tense as it became. Like it was a lot tighter, a lot sort of more frenetic than I necessarily expected initially.
Yeah, it definitely gets a little bit more intense, a little bit more make things happen very quickly instead of slowly evaluate this room. But early on, when I first booted the game up, it felt to me almost like a Tim Burton Nightmare Before Christmas. With
or
some
like a
of
Coraline kind of thing.
Yeah,
Coraline.
Absolutely.
A lot of long limbs and heavy characters that look slopped together. And I feel like that was the dominating aesthetic. And, things that should not be alive being alive, like the little mushroom-headed people that you run into. But
I actually got more of a feel of the other Tim Burton film, 9, that animated film. I got a lot of that kind of vibe from this game, because that was a similar film of his that had a similar scale. You were there was a small protagonist in a world that was much bigger than the protagonist. And that's one of the reasons why I picked the game. I said, this seems really cool. I want to see some of this art style.
Yeah, it definitely throws a lot darker earlier than any of those movies do, though. Like, one of the first rooms you stumble into, you're basically in the bowels of a ship. You can tell that it's a ship because the camera rocks back and forth.
Yeah, it creaks
slightly. It's really interesting. Early on, I didn't realize I was on a ship until I noticed that there were certain jumps that you could only make when the ship tilted very extremely one way or the other. And I thought that was a really subtle effect that added both a sense of place and also mechanical relevance. But you're in the bowels of this ship, and you're moving kind of from room to room. One of the first rooms just has a guy hanging.
Yeah, the very second one you go to, I think.
Right.
Yeah. There's a person who's hung himself, and then you use the chair he hung himself on to, like, do some platforming.
Noteworthy, it's a very thin person.
Yeah. And it is, as soon as you see that, you're like, oh, this is what I'm in for. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. And I think that the game actually gets darker from there.
It certainly doesn't lighten up.
Well, I think there's more light, but the tone darkens. Because I'm thinking of this in contrast to a game like Amnesia: The Dark Descent, where the game starts off a little more like physically lighter, and as you get further and further, darkness becomes your enemy. It's not quite like that.
Well, it makes sense from the ship perspective, right? If we're starting below the water line in the bowels and then moving up, there'd necessarily be more light.
Yeah, and the first section of the game, you're at first just navigating these environments. There are no other people. You will occasionally run into these little mushroom people, and you can find them.
They're referred to as gnomes.
Gnomes? Okay. Little fungi. And when you find them, they will run away from you until you can kind of find them in these little rooms where they can't get away. And then you can run up to them and hug them. And then they're your buddies. Follow you around for a little bit. And that's kind of adorable.
While we're talking about this, we should talk a little bit about all the collectibles in the game.
Yeah.
And some of the achievements you get for them. So that was one of them. You can find the gnomes. You can approach them. You can hug them. There is actually some pretty intricate level sequencing that you have to do to get some of the gnome scenes to trigger. I think there's 13/14 in the game. We'll talk about why there's not actually 14, but there's 13/14 gnomes to interact with in the game. And some of the triggers are pretty tight, and you can break the sequence by accident and not get that gnome to trigger. So they're pretty well hidden Easter eggs, despite this being a pretty tiny game. So those are one of the collectibles. There's another one you want to talk. Someone else wants to talk about that.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to do it briefly. There's also a series of they're just like jars, basically. Would that be the best way to describe?
They're little statues.
Yeah, little statues that you break, and it makes sort of like a wispy, smoky sort of thing comes out, and there's a little like breathy sort of noise. That's the other one. I'm not really sure what they are. I didn't get all of them.
Yeah, they're little geisha statues. They're statues, I think, of the maiden of the ship, and
Okay, that
you
makes sense.
destroy them, and there's some essence that gets out, and then you can light lamps and candles.
Yep.
Those are the 3 collectible types, and I know that you get achievements for lighting more candles. I assume that all the achievements are just do this thing, and then you get an achievement. Nothing gigantic story-related seems to happen.
Yeah, that's what it seemed like for the most part.
Yeah,
They
I'm
are
just
pretty well
gonna-
written as well.
I'm going to fact check that because I want to make sure that there's no actual narrative piece that we're missing, or maybe I saw it because I got everything and I don't know what you guys didn't see. So I'm gonna fact check that while we're going through.
Okay.
But I know that for the statues and for the gnomes, you have to find all of them if there is something to be triggered. You have to get all of them. I know for the candles and the lanterns, there's like 30 something in the game, and you only need 20 of them to do whatever is triggerable by that.
Okay. Well,
So it's possible to miss
didn't
like
get
a
all of them.
lantern. It's possible to miss a lantern or a candle, and still get whatever is out there. Because I think there's an achievement specifically for 20 of them, and there's 30 something, maybe exactly 30 or like 30 plus a little bit in the game.
Okay. Well, as you go through these early part of the game, you get some of those collectibles. You're largely just navigating empty spaces with creepy pictures and stuff on them. And the game kind of takes a hard turn as soon as you enter this room where there are children sleeping. Your child is... She's got he or she, you don't really know. 6, the name of your character is 6. And 6 is just kind of skulking around this room with all these other children sleeping. And as you walk in there, this long-armed creature, this long-armed man descends from the ceiling and starts looking at kids, like running his hands over kids.
I feel like he's sort of like making sure that they're sleeping, but like in a really creepy, spooky way.
Yes. He spooky checks on them, but he's got these long, gangly arms that are really unsettling to look at.
Oh yeah. They actually if he were standing at rest, his elbows would be touching the floor, and then his forearms go forward like the length of his torso.
Yeah.
It's really weird.
Yeah, he's got a long standing reach.
Definitely.
His wingspan much higher than his vertical.
Jay Bills loves it.
Just real quick, back to the collectibles. I found out what they do.
Okay.
I didn't see it because I didn't dig deep, but I have it apparently. On future playthroughs, if you get all the geisha dolls, you can wear the mother's mask instead of like you wear your raincoat with the hood pulled back and there's like a mask on you instead. So like a cool aesthetic change. And then the gnomes unlock concept art and stuff.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So nothing gigantic story-wise, but...
Not like a
cool.
new narrative piece that you would have missed, like a secret ending or something. Not like that, apparently.
Yeah. So once you get that... this creature's called the Janitor, this long-armed... He's blind, too, and he seems to have a sense of smell that's very strong.
Yeah, smell and hearing, it seems.
Yeah. Once you encounter him the first time, you then run into a bunch of other rooms where he will show up. And at first, it's just kind of rooms that he's in, and you have to avoid him a little bit. But as you make your way through the bowels a little bit further, he eventually just comes to be chasing you, room after room after room, looking after you.
Yeah, and this is where the sound comes in, right? Because he's blind, you have to sort of manipulate his position a lot of the time by throwing things, knocking jars off of shelves, just generally making a clamor so he'll shift, and then you can run past him.
Yeah, and if you get caught by him, it's game over, basically. He'll grab you with his long arms, and then ostensibly something terrible happens.
I think it's implied you get eaten, because other areas in the game when you get caught, that seems to be a recurring theme. If you don't die to the environment, like something crushing you or falling off a cliff, if something grabs you, you get nibbled on.
Yeah, it seems like it for the most part.
Yeah, and as you're kind of making your escape from the Janitor, there are a bunch of different locations that seem to imply that kids are basically a source of fuel, or something bad is happening to kids. Like there's a section where there are kids turned to stone by this all-seeing eye, If you're caught in the eye's gaze, you get turned to stone. Early on, your character starts getting hungry, and you basically start losing control of your character until another small child throws you like a loaf of bread, and you eat the loaf of bread in order to keep going. And the next time you get hit by a hunger attack, there is meat in a cage, and it's like obviously a trap, and your character cannot help themselves but eats the meat in the cage and then gets caught by the janitor. And when you escape, there are other children also trapped in cages.
I want to talk really quick about sort of staged and like scripted vulnerability of a character, because this sequence and these two sequences that we talked about just now, and there's more in the game that we're going to talk about. This happens again in future. I bet Gino's just getting up to it.
Yeah.
But this game reminds me a lot of Hyperlight Drifter, because there were also these like scripted moments of vulnerability where the character of Hyperlight Drifter would like have coughing fits and cough up blood. And it was implied by the developer of Hyperlight Drifter, or said specifically that it was to mirror one of the developer's own, like, I think it was a heart condition or something similar to that caused him to have health issues, and he wanted there to be a character that had all this power and causal efficacy in a world, but still have it while being afflicted by an ailment that would just sporadically cause him to become weak and vulnerable. I think something similar is going to be implied here, but the opposite direction, towards more and more and more vulnerability. But I wanted to draw that as like a piece of narrative design that was intentional, these like scripted vulnerabilities, more than just I have a hunger meter like in some other games might have had.
Yeah, and those scripted moments of vulnerability escalate in terms of their implications. In Hyperlight Drifter, it's clear that your character is getting sicker and sicker, whereas in this game, I would say also, your character is getting sicker and sicker.
Yeah.
But in a different kind of way.
That's a fair way to put it.
The first thing you eat is bread, the second thing you eat is raw meat, and it gets worse from there. But escaping the janitor, I think, is... that the janitor might be my favorite enemy. It's close. I mean, there are a lot of really good enemy designs in this game.
There are. For how... I mean, they're not like overly complex. There's basically 4 if you count the lady of the house as well. But each of them's... they're unique while still fitting into the overall aesthetic. You know what I mean? Like they fit in this environment, but each one's sort of new and interesting. Especially, I like the third one the best, personally.
Yes, agreed. But the janitor, once he catches you and you have to free yourself from a cage, and there's all these other children also caught in cages, and you eventually kind of stumble down a shaft full of shoes, implying that all of these kids are getting caught and taken away, and only their shoes are left because their shoes aren't worth anything. And you end up down this shaft full of shoes in this room like a Scrooge McDuck vault, but children's shoes.
And I think it's fairly clear, and I've seen it mentioned before, this isn't as if it's my original idea, but the shoes are a fairly clear bit of Holocaust imagery. That like one of the problems the Nazi regime had as sort of part of their final solution was what to do with all the clothes and all the shoes of, the people they murdered. And they would just be these piles and piles of shoes that were often left as a memorial. And I think this is a pretty clear homage in this case to that, which I'm not sure how I feel about. Like, it obviously does work. I get why it's here, but I don't know if the game's subject matter, sort of gravitas, warrants that sort of very explicit allusion to probably the paradigmatic historical genocide.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the game really draws inspiration. I mean, the place you're in is called the Maw,
right? And
it basically grinds up children. Once you escape, you get into this Scrooge McDuck vault. There's like a shoe shark that chases after you when you're in there, and then it becomes very clear the way you escape after you fight the janitor. Because he's blind, he kind of gropes around. You're in this elevator or something with a door that's trying to shut, and there's a little crate in there that's kind of holding the door open, and he sticks his arms underneath this rapidly closing door, and you defeat him by like breaking this crate so that it snaps his arms off. And then you escape by jumping on top of what looks to be like a human body wrapped up in a sheet, pretty much, on a meat
like
hook.
Butcher paper almost, yeah.
Yeah. It's very clear that it's little kids. It's kids that have been turned into meat. And getting up to the second section when you're in the kitchen, it brings this home even further, that this is a place that is built upon the exploitation and consumption of the young.
Yeah, which, obviously is horrendous and all its sort of implications. My only concern is I don't know if it has the sort of historical gravitas or historical resonance to deploy an image like that sort of sea of shoes in this context.
Yeah.
Now, in the game's defense, it was really just one room in the game.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a recurring theme or anything.
Fair point, Billy.
But I agree that if the game is pointing at, I think the game didn't need any of that to achieve its overall commentary, and if it was an explicit point at that kind of historical happening, I think it was just not warranted at all. But I'm not convinced that it was like an explicit homage. I shouldn't even call it an homage. That seems too
allusion.
Positive.
Yeah,
like an allusion to a Holocaust scenario. I think they were just thinking what would be kind of creepy to have to notice, to say that we're not only is this happening to the protagonist, but lots and lots of kids. How about an ocean of discarded kids' clothes? It might have just been a coincidence, but I can see how a person could very easily read into it, especially since it was put into the game pretty early, and they hadn't had exposure to the rest of the whole game yet.
Just from if we abstract from the history of it, it is just sort of a striking image, right? If it didn't have this sort of history, I would be, impressed by it. But, once you start going down that sort of coincidence road, and I don't think you necessarily are arguing for it that strongly, but you open up a whole can of worms. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, that image is really evocative, and I think it works within the context of the game. And I think that even if it evokes that imagery, I don't think it's necessarily out of place with the themes that this game is evoking overall.
No, I agree. I just think it needs a historical referent that this game doesn't have. It exists outside historical context.
I don't mind being the person on the podcast that is probably the least well-read person and certainly the least politically involved person. But when I saw that scene, what I thought about was the scene from Star Wars when they got put in the trash compactor.
Yeah. Because
the enemy of that level or that sequence was like an unseen monster that would burrow under the shoes and try to come get you. And I was like, oh, I'm like in a trash compactor from Star Wars. So that was my first thought, and I didn't think about any of this historical implication until you mentioned it.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I had that thought as well. I'm not sure in what order they came, but even that sort of, I don't know what to do with that juxtaposition, but I think that's an interesting one as well now that we bring it up.
Yeah. And once you escape from that section of the game and you go to the kitchen, I feel like the kitchen makes the grotesquerie a little bit more universal, I would say. You deal with these two just fat chefs that both have just melty faces. And it seems like
skin masks.
They're almost Jabba the Hutt, even to bring more Star Wars into this. It's not far from the truth.
They are these gigantic bulbous things with just folds of skin, these sausage arms, and their faces are these disgusting. They look like they've been out in the sun too long, like they're made of rubber and they've just been out in the sun too long. And then at some points during their animation loop, they seem to lift up underneath their face, and there seems to be another face underneath it.
They scratch underneath it like it itches.
Yeah, like there's a mouth under the mouth, which I don't like. And
I'm not sure if it's. I saw that and I did a double take. I'm not sure if it's an action of the mouth or just like a mouth looking like jowl.
I don't know, but damn, it looks like there's a mouth under the mouth. You know what? This game's weird and gross. So
gross either way.
Either they are so large that there is there's room under there for things to be discolored, or as soon as I saw that, I'm like, are these not even human? Like, are these creatures not even supposed to be distorted human? Like, they're supposed to be something even more foul? And I think the game is definitely going for that.
And during this whole time, as they're sort of scratching their under faces, they're also hacking at these just hunks of what presumably is child meat with these massive bloody cleavers.
Yes. And they are cutting up fish. They're rooting around in things. They're chopping up steaks. Everything is meat all the time in this kitchen. And all of these chefs are basically chasing you around. At first, you're just kind of sneaking around the kitchen. You eventually have to deal with the chefs, like get around them and try to escape. And they are one of the enemies that as soon as they catch you, they will pick you up and drop you in a pot and cook you up. Yeah. And that's real gross.
It's worth noting here too that we've remarked on the character's hunger up until this point. You walk through a kitchen completely filled with food of all types. There are apples and fruits and things. If understandably Six didn't want to eat the meat, but ignores all of it. At no point does Six eat anything in the kitchen by this point.
Yeah, and that was something that was a little bit frustrating to me as like a kind of story gap, because you crawl around that kitchen and you can go up into the rafters and there's bread up there. There's all sorts of stuff you can eat that is not as offensive as some of the things she's eaten up until this point. But I feel like Six, the story they're trying to get at with the hunger is not one of actual sustenance hunger, I think.
No.
It is very much a descent into inhumanity that they're trying to depict.
And I think
at some point I'm going to push back on that because I think it is talking about sustenance hunger, but we'll get to that later.
Okay.
I would have fixed this problem because I have the same narrative issue if they had just made the healthy-looking foods actually spoiled and rotten. Like, that would have made a lot more sense to me. And when I got to the kitchen before I closely examined any of the food, I was like, oh, I bet all these vegetables are just, like, gross and rotten. No, wait, this is a perfectly fine carrot. What's up?
No, I think that's part of the point. Like, Six starts with bread being okay, then it's raw meat. Then the next thing you run into is a rat in a trap. The rat is hurt, but not dead, and you eat it to death. You bite into the living flesh of a rat.
You're right, but specifically that rat was going to die.
Yes.
I think that's an important distinction. It was in a mousetrap, and there was no escape for the rat, but it hadn't perished yet. It was still alive.
Yes, and it is very clearly a descent. There's an arc here on the things that Six finds herself eating, and I think that is not accidental. I think that is the descent of Six, the corruption of this child. And you eventually dealing with the chefs. You do not kill them. You evade them, and then both of them just kind of like try and take you out, but fail.
Yeah.
You can cook though in this level.
You can?
Yeah, you can get an achievement for cooking.
What do you cook?
You pick up like a carrot. You can pick up like a fish head and there's might be like bread, and then there's a piece of cheese you can get. You can like throw them all into a pot, and then you get an achievement for being like chef's little helper.
Nice.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Good get.
There's also really cool achievements.
That sausage puzzle's really good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you do make sausage.
There's an achievement you get in the first level for just jumping up on your bed like an excessive amount of times, like, hey, stop and have fun a little while. And then at some other part of the game where you are you have to like raise or lower like a piano and then jump across it. If you drop down to the keys and just run back and forth a couple times, the achievement is called Six's Song, and I think that's the only time that the game actually names Six.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I don't think her name is given anywhere else except for that achievement.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, the kitchen section, that sausage puzzle might be my favorite puzzle in the whole game.
Going to get the meats.
Yeah, you have to drop meats into this sausage grinder because you need to get to a doorknob that's across the room, and you need to be able to swing over to there. And so you have to create sausage links by finding hunks of meat in the area above you to throw into the grinder. And at one point in that section, you can find a little gnome who's died of cold. It looks like he's frozen to death. And I'm like, oh no, you're gonna make me fucking throw this gnome into the meat grinder, aren't you, game? This is where this is going, isn't it? And no, that was not. You just had to watch him get like pecked by a bird or eaten by a rat or something.
If only.
But instead, you had to find hunks of meat to grind up. But once you escape the kitchen, you get to probably the most grotesque and upsetting part of the game. You climb up to. You get to the outside for a bit. You see the light, and the scope of the ship that you're in comes into full view. It's gigantic, and there's another ship that is docked with your ship, and there are people walking into the maw. And it's a pretty striking scene. It's really well done.
Yeah, the camera pans back. You're climbing up the side of this boat. It's sort of like dusk almost. It's also probably the most sort of it's there's like this is a game full of moments that are striking for their own reasons. This is probably the only one that I think was striking for just the epicness of it.
Yeah, agreed.
There's also a part worthy to note here. As soon as you step out into that scene, the first second you step out, it's far too bright for you to actually control your character. You can't see where you're going, and I died when I fell off by accident and had to redo that. But I was like, shit, it's so bright. The game makes you really feel the first time the sun hits you.
Yeah, and there are a lot of times where this game's physics felt a little bit finicky. There are definitely a ton of moments where you're walking on an object that is not square, and if it's rounded, you can easily fall off the edge just by accident. I found the platforming in this game to be a little loose, but not necessarily to the game's complete detriment. Like, I could get through it.
The restarts are forgiving, too, I mean, which is worth saying.
Real quick, did you guys play with mouse and keyboard or controller?
Mouse and keyboard.
Controller.
So I played with mouse and keyboard, but I was on a laptop, so I didn't have like a full mouse. I had my trackpad, and that was impossible.
That sounds terrible.
I rebound the controls, and I was totally fine. This game does give you full control rebinding for all of its actions, and I think every game should have that, but this game does, specifically because when I played it, I didn't have access to either my Logitech plug-and-play controller or my PS3 controller or a full mouse, so I was kind of like stuck, and I thought this would just be like a WASD control game, and it was for the most part, but you needed to like mouse click some stuff, and I couldn't do that. Those controls were just broken on a trackpad, so I had to rebind that to another button, and it was fine, but I think it's worthy to note that my control scheme was broken, but the game gave me a way to fix it.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
So this section, Pete, you wanted to talk about this section in particular?
Yeah, I think so. This is, I think, the part where really sort of the dark spirited way comes in, because you're operating in this. It's not really a bathhouse, but it's a cruise ship of some sort, and it's just filled with these grotesque, just rotund. They look like business executives. They're all in suits. I think the women are in pantsuits for the most part. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Some sort of business dress, and they're all just chowing down in the most sort of disgusting, spittle-flying, hands-to-face way possible. And as you sort of run past them, run near them, the first moment it happens, it's incredible almost. So if you haven't seen it, go see it now. I'll pause for a second. Go see it now. Okay, you're back. So the first time you walk up, they leap out of their chair and sort of scurry along the ground after you, which I just thought was incredible. Like, it was scary, it was disgusting, it was unexpected. Just a wonderful, wonderful moment.
Yeah, at first, when you're in this section, it is this Japanese-style restaurant. And at first, they look like they're just patrons eating food, and it's gross. Like, it's very gross what's happening. Yeah. They're grotesque looking.
But it's not threatening at first.
Yeah, it's not threatening. Like, you're able to move around underneath them, and they don't seem to be interested in you. They just seem to be wanting to eat in almost a Wall-E kind of way.
Yeah.
But then once they become aware of you, one of them, when he knocks out of his chair and starts just dragging himself along the ground after you. His face contorts in a way, and just the hunger conveyed in his face really reminds me a little bit of a few different Miyazaki movies. I think Princess Mononoke. There's a pig monster at the beginning of that game. At the beginning of that movie,
yes,
he starts out looking like a boar, and then
my favorite Miyazaki. I'll just say that.
It's a really good movie. He just becomes more and more of a demon as that sequence in the movie happens, and as he transforms, he becomes more and more grotesque. And I feel like that's a pretty good, like the undulation of this thing that was once biological and understandable, and turning into kind of this otherworldly
just wriggles.
blob. Yeah, it turns from something solid and fleshy into something wriggly and almost worm-like. And that face, the faces of these creatures, very similar. And Howl's Moving Castle, there are some sections also with things just maws, just big open mouths.
Yeah, the basically like black goo minions that the queen sends out, or the witch, I guess.
Yeah, just these sections. The faces are incredible. I think that just some of the best character portrait work, or character work, 3D animation, 3D modeling, animations, all that stuff in this section of the game. And those enemies are almost entirely done up by their animations. And it is horrifying when you're near them.
It 100% is. And to the game's credit, I think there's very few repeat character models. You walk through a sequence where you are running across a dinner table and they're like grabbing at you with their like grubby sausage hands. And I just rewatched the scene while Pete said stop and go watch it. And I was like, wait, also all these faces are like, these are all different character models. They're not just like the same fat dude. Now they all look the same because they're all grotesquely obese characters, but they actually have like different noses and mouth styles, and some have like more like messed up teeth, and like they're all like almost individually made.
Yeah, this is a case where the overlap is deliberative, because I think they're generally supposed to evoke that sort of homogeneity as sort of a class. Like we'll get into that in a second, but it's not a repetition because it's laziness, and not necessarily laziness, but just sort of required effort. It's more the elements that are repeated are meant to mark these off as a distinct group, a distinct unit, as opposed to the other people you meet.
Yeah, and these are these old, generally white faces of these heavy-set characters. And man, there's this one woman who eats sausage, and her mouth is parsed, like she's eating, like she's like slurping down a noodle or something, but it's sausage. And the way she eats a sausage might be one of the most vile things I've ever seen. Like her head shakes like orgasmically, like she just loves this fucking sausage. And if you get caught by her, she then eats you like that. And it's really unsettling. But it really, this sequence, I think, culminates in one of the coolest and most upsetting escape scenes I've ever seen in a game. You eventually start escaping this dinner, this dining room, and more of the patrons come to notice you. And they just become a wave of humanity that is crawling after you, crawling on top of each other, knocking down plates, knocking down walls, just to try and eat your small child character. And as you escape, I think, on a hook again. And as you escape, like, they billow over almost like lemmings or something.
Yeah, it's one of the coolest things I think I've seen since... What was it? I think was that Inside, where all those bodies fuse into sort of one mass of just gelatinous limbs?
That was Inside.
Yeah, I think one of the coolest sort of, and a very similar sort of effect as that just mass of bodies and limbs in Inside.
I've been watching this sequence while we've been talking about it. I do see some repeat character models, but
there's maybe like 10.
Yeah, I think there's probably like 6 or 8 of them, and I want to point out now that what made me think there were so many more was the use of lighting on them, and there was a lot of great physics for. It's gonna sound gross, but like the rolls in their faces, and the way the shadows caught some of their faces, and like the swinging, like almost like interview, like interrogation room lights that are just like on their faces and like changing the shadows makes them all look different. But man, that was well done. God, that is so grotesque.
Yeah, and this game is largely shot almost like a diorama. It's shot from the side, and your character is kind of operating with the fourth wall cut out. And so you're largely walking forward and back, but there's a hard wall that you run into if you move too close to the camera. And that diorama effect really allows the developers to frame their shots just how they want to. You can end up with these effects where you can only see characters from behind because there's no way to turn the camera to face them. There are these very cool moments where, you know, you're climbing up and all of a sudden you're going to move between floors and the camera kind of pulls out and tracks, you know, finds another way into the room. And I think that helps accentuate this moment, Billy, because a lot of the character models that do repeat, you don't notice it because you're seeing them from behind or you're seeing them from the side. And all of a sudden, this character model that might show up 3 or 4 times, you've actually seen it in a different context, all 4 of them, outside of just lighting and presentation.
And also, when you see one of them, you're like running for your life, so you're not really paying that much attention. And then you can see them when they're at a table and they haven't noticed you yet, and then you can notice them. They get a lot of mileage out of these character models.
Yeah, and the final section of the game, the ladies' quarters, you wind up kind of running into this geisha who seems to run this place. And her quarters are full of kimonos and mannequins. Mannequins wearing kimonos. And they do a nice job of disguising, oh, is it her or is it a mannequin? They play around with that a little bit. And I at least noticed that all of the mirrors were broken all throughout the house. And you eventually have to take on the lady of the house. Did you guys notice what there were the broken mirrors, but there were also pictures that had pieces of cloth and stuff draped over them. Did you see any of those pictures or notice what was underneath?
I know that the woman's face is grotesque.
Well, the portraits seem to be of little girls with black hair.
Right.
And on your way up to facing this woman, you get hungry again, and there's a gnome, and he has a sausage for you, and he offers you a sausage. And instead of eating the sausage, you eat the gnome. You kill the gnome instead.
You like jump at him and like beast like attack him.
Yeah, you bite him in the neck and kill him, and then if you walk up to the sausage, you have no interest in the sausage. So I feel like the game, this is where the whole descent narrative, I think, really fits, because the first thing you eat is bread, then raw meat, then a rat that is wounded but alive, then a gnome that is trying to offer you help. So you descend from inanimate to formerly animate to animate but just morally justifiable to kill, like almost euthanasia, to killing for no reason. Killing with clear alternatives. And at that point, I feel like 6 stops being I kind of sympathize with 6, but at that point, I felt like, oh, this isn't the story of a child who's going to escape to freedom. This is the story about a child who's going to murder the person who runs this place and become that person. Like, whatever you're doing to escape is making you irredeemably changed. And, like, at a certain point, you stop being the character who is acted upon and you start becoming an actor.
Mm-hmm. And I think, the story, it's sparse in its way, right? There are lots of ways you can interpret it just based on its sparseness. And, I think I'm going to give a couple of interpretations just to start off, right? But I think one of the ways you can do it, obviously, is, this could potentially just be my passion, but as an economic narrative, obviously, right, this place is the mall in which children, the sort of most vulnerable, are ground up for what seems to be a class of capitalists who, let it be known they eat like swine. Capitalist swine is a fairly well-known epithet. So I think that sort of reading is, on the surface at least, highly plausible and almost encouraged by the game itself.
Yeah.
And strictly, I think it is a largely food-based commentary, but I think the overarching theme is really indulgence, not so much just food, but really just this like hyper indulgence. And we'll get to the food stuff later because I have some specific stuff that I want to talk about that relates to the food and what I think 6 is going through. But I agree with your point here that there can be a sort of overarching capitalist commentary about how we attain these indulgences that the highest of high class enjoy, sometimes to a fault, a gluttonous level. But it is often at the expense of those that can't protect themselves or are subjugated in many ways.
Yeah, this game is really about consumption, and when your character starts becoming the consumer at the expense of others, it really changed my perspective on who I was playing as. It did not redeem any of the characters that I ran into before. It just made my character less sympathetic. And when you eventually come up to the lady of the house, you fight her. She's kind of a ghost. She can teleport around and do magics. And you find a mirror that when you shine it on her or show her the mirror, she is kind of wounded. You have to keep doing this sequence over and over and over again. It's a pretty scary sequence too, because she kind of hovers outside of your range, and she'll kind of come in on you really quickly. But when you finally defeat her, she is kind of down and wounded, and then you consume her.
Yep.
You eat her. And so then the cycle is complete. By consuming her, your character gains these dark powers, and then you have this moment of catharsis where you walk back through the restaurant with all of these people who had tried to eat you before. They will try to eat you again, but whenever they get near you, the new dark powers you acquired cause them to basically have their necks snapped and turn them into darkness. And you'll basically clear the room just by walking near it. It's one of the more effective power trip sequences I've ever seen.
So I'd like to talk about then, Gino. You used a phrase, sort of moment of catharsis. You read this as a positive moment, sort of a finish that empowers Six in her struggle. I
think that it's got dual readings. I think that there is this moment of power and catharsis where Six is turning the powers that that subjugated her and threatened her life against those who would have destroyed her. But there's also this moment of complicitness where Six is not breaking the cycle of violence. She is just simply enacting it anew. I think that with the pictures having that are covered with tarps in the ladies' quarters, looking like almost like Six, it seemed like this was a cycle that had played out multiple times with different characters. Like, there are more kimonos than there are women wearing the kimono, right? I would assume that one person does not need all of those mannequins worth of clothes. It seemed like this was an ancient place that lasted longer than that. So to see all of these characters that have tried to destroy you have their comeuppance, I thought was satisfying, but it seemed very clear that this moment is not to be celebrated.
Absolutely.
So I want to share the reading that I took of the whole game and specifically this moment. But I look at this not from a necessarily like a capitalist or a sort of an indulgent perspective, but when I read this game, I was reading this as a commentary on child abuse and specifically child neglect. There's a lot of different forms of abuse of children. But what made me think about child abuse was that we never hear Six say anything. And so frequently victims of child abuse have no voice to cry out and stop any things that are bad things that are happening to them. I think that it's one way to read all of her hunger sequences as a descent into a more sinister or wicked or sick individual, but I see these as moments of desperation where at first you're eating bread and things are very savable. You can totally turn around and you're eating raw meat now, and this is a bleak situation, and now you eat a rat that was living, and that's you killing something. And when you are offered the opportunity to have the sausage, which is more foodie food, or kill the gnome, and you kill the gnome, I think that was I was trying to be a commentary on when like a person who is facing a situation of child abuse now has an option and will instead go down a darker path. Ultimately, then the scene of Six consuming the woman after she's been defeated, I don't find catharsis there. I don't see any sort of like victory fanfare. I think of this as those people that are often victims of child abuse and neglect end up becoming perpetrators themselves. So like and in that sense, our readings align quite a bit, because in that case the cycle would continue. But I see this as a big commentary on child neglect and how it could be so stoppable in many circumstances, but in a lot of ways the children don't have causal efficacy to go to bat for themselves, which is accentuated by the world being much larger than Six and her being so causally weak in the world around her. So that was my reading of this, and I think that specifically like the stages of hunger and food, I'm reading a little bit differently, from more of a desperation and then a place where you're mentally compromised, so you have a better choice and you don't choose it. You sort of choose to go further. I didn't read specifically that sequence as I'm now like a bad guy or an evil villain. I read that more of a here's the part where the child abuse takes a turn that may be unsavable.
Yeah, Billy, I think that's a legitimate and a very interesting reading, and it fits into the sort of cyclical pattern that's being established here as well, right? Because sort of, I wish I had some more research on this, but I know one of the risk factors of becoming an abuser yourself is if you were abused as a child. And it just sort of fits in this sort of cyclical idea that's happening towards the very end.
And let's think about how some of the enemies have interacted with you up until that point. Is there was an enemy, and this may be a little bit farther reach for a reading, but the janitor couldn't see you, but if you were heard, that's when you were in trouble. So like maybe in this case, in some of these child abuse situations, it's not necessarily bad to be seen, but if you are heard out of line, if you make noise, if you make clutter, what do you do that's when you get punished. Mm-hmm. And what are some of the ways that the child character does make, like, I guess in what the child's perspective is, progress is doing things like turning on lights to create comfort, or smashing objects that represent the person that's oppressing them, or like finding cuddly creatures to hug. Those were things that are, I guess, further extensions of this reading that maybe aren't as maybe are like not as tight or like not as supportable. I think they could be interesting parts of this too.
Yeah, and I like in that reading that the moment where you attack the gnome, it's not that Six is inevitably corrupted. It's that she can't. There is a better way, and she can't even see it. Like the gnome is trying to give her an out where she does not have to harm anyone, but because of the abuse, she cannot see that as a way forward. She only sees the violence.
That's a better articulation that I thought of. Like I wish I had phrased it in that way, but that's my point articulated better than I could.
Yeah, and I think that both of these readings interplay.
Yeah.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
Because I bet how would the first cycle of this have come about? Probably almost identical to what your reading was, Gino. Of someone becoming just darker and darker and darker.
Yeah, and the game does say on its Steam page that the maw is full of corrupted souls. Like It's very explicit that this is what they're kind of getting at, but the nature of that corruption and how it plays out on the characters on the ship, I think is important.
I think this would be a really good time actually to bring up the DLC because this is the perfect story, I guess, complement for it.
Well, but Philly, before you do that, can I do one more reading?
Yeah, go for it. I'm going to look up some of my notes. So go ahead.
So I'd like to just sort of add just a little bit to this to sort of, complicate it, extend it a little bit. So in terms of sort of the one final ending, there's a super well-known quote that I think will apply here at sort of multiple levels, right? So this quote comes from it was a speech to, let me get this right, the New York University Institute for the Humanities. They did a conference in 2007, and there was a speaker there, Audre Lorde. I think that's how you pronounce it, Lorde. The speech was titled, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." And this is probably a quote you guys might have been familiar with. So I'll read the quote, and then I'm going to sort of situate it a little bit more. So the quote is, "For the Master's tools will never dismantle the Master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." Or that's sort of the idea. And it's become very popular, obviously so, in sort of anti-capitalist circles, where the argument is like, listen, we can't use neoliberal capitalism to beat neoliberal capitalism. So if you want to do that sort of economic reading, you could do that and look at that ending. That's Six trying to use the Master's tools, in this case the powers of the, let's just say, Witch Mother, to tear down the house. Right? You guys with me so far?
Yeah.
Cool. So, moving past that, right, if you situate Lorde's quote back in its original context, the whole speech is really about feminism. Here, there's a great explanation of it if you want. It's an essay called "The Master's Tool, The Wisdom of Audre Lorde" by Micah White. And he sort of points out how it's all about her railing against sort of how feminism, at least at the time and in this context at the NYU conference, elided differences between different sexualities, black feminists, other races, that sort of thing, right? So I'm going to read a little bit of an extended section. I think this situation is in context. "As women, we have been taught either to ignore our differences or to view them as causes for separation and suspicion rather than as forces for change. Without community, there is no liberation, only the most vulnerable and temporary armistice between an individual and her oppression. But community must not mean a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that these differences do not exist. Those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths." And then that's why she launches into the quote, "For the Master's tools, so on and so forth." Right? So why do I bring this up? So I think this adds an interesting interplay to the witch at the end. Mm-hmm. Right? Because you can tell she's very concerned with this sort of idea of aesthetic perfection. Right? She wears that sort of kabuki mask. All the mirrors in the house are shattered. She's spending all this time sort of brushing her hair. Right? It's a very sort of aestheticized environment. Right? And I think what this operates in is this sort of idea of potentially, right? I don't know how much the rest of the narrative fits in it, but this sort of Six exists outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, right? This society being this sort of witch mother in the world she's created. And now what she's trying to do, I think, is situate herself back into that world by taking her powers, trying to use the Master's tools to dismantle the Master's house. And I think it's an interesting sort of question of aesthetics, femininity, female beauty, and how Six is sort of playing into that power as a means of trying to escape it. But ultimately, I think she fails.
Yeah, and I think that plays into the ultimate ending of the game after the credits. You end up with Six at the top of having escaped the maw. It turns out that the maw is built into an island, it looks like, and there is no escape. You can get out, you can be on top of the ship, but there is no escape. There's nowhere to go. And so she mustn't necessarily go back inside. Having tossed the house, she must go back in and realize that there is no better way.
Exactly right. She's realized this sort of temporary victory, but it's ultimately unsustainable.
Yeah. And I think that reading fits in. I don't know if it fits in with the earlier parts of the game, but
exactly
definitely
right.
with those moments with the Kabuki character, and that fight, that ultimately the thing that defeats her is vanity.
Yeah, it's the mirror.
It's the mirror that brings her down. But yeah, this game evokes a lot in what it does with. It's silent. It's fairly silent. It's only a few hours long. It's pretty remarkable how much they managed to evoke in that space with so little explicit narrative. It's really a triumph. And I didn't expect it when I started. I started this game. I didn't expect to even like it, and I like it a lot.
Now, Billy, how does the DLC complicate this? Does it ruin everything I just said?
No, it actually doesn't touch any of our readings necessarily.
Cool.
But it adds a little bit of more depth to this universe. So I want to talk about this as not just an addition to the story, but what I think DLC should be. Because this is one of my favorite DLCs, and unfortunately I watched it, so I'm not going to get the same gratification by playing it, so I may not purchase it. But if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't played the game yet, I would highly advise just buy it all in a big bundle, especially on a Steam sale. Just get everything together because it's going to enhance the experience. So this Little Nightmares proper was like 4 chapters. I can't remember if the Mistress's Place had was a tiny 5th chapter, but it was basically four major zones, and the DLC offers 3 more. They're roughly the same length. Each of the chapters, so that you could think about there being 7 chapters in total. I'm not going to talk about all their implications, but specifically 3 moments. Actually, 4 moments specifically in the DLC. First things first, the protagonist is different. It's a young boy who's typically referred to as the kid or the runaway kid. And if it wasn't made clear in Little Nightmares proper, there's other kids that are trying to escape. You see it when you see the petrified children that were sort of turned to stone by the gazing eye. You see it in some of the other caged children. Just the fact that there are these sort of long-armed janitors that catch kids. Other kids are trying to escape or have in the past. And there's a moment. I should say it like this: the first DLC level is the introduction of the runaway kid, and you go through a level, you fight some old lady granny boss. It's a really cool boss sequence, but that ends with you getting caught by a janitor, put in a cage, and right after the sequence in Little Nightmares, the original game, when you eat the raw meat in the cage and then you get put in that little stack of cages, he's the one that gets pulled away by the janitor in the opening of that scene. So he's paralleled in 6's universe doing stuff. And that was really cool. And in the second part of the DLC, you see 2 cool things. One, I don't know if you guys saw this, but there was a sequence in Little Nightmares itself where you can go into this hidden room and you look through one of the big eyeball machines, one of the viewing machines. Did you guys see that?
I'm not sure.
There was a hidden room. There was no enemies in it. You could just press a button and it would turn on one of the eyeball viewing machines, and you could just flip through 4 or 5 scenes.
Yeah.
And it showed you some other parts of the game, some other parts of the level. Well, you find one like that for the runaway kid, and you watch 6 going through the ocean of shoes. So he's watching her during part of her journey, so he clearly knows about her. And then that DLC level is called The Hideaway, and you find a little I don't know if it's a little village, but of all the gnomes, and there's a lot of them, more than what 6 encounters. And I can't remember exactly how this is implied. I think it's with the gnomes' shadows or some projection of them, or some maybe a drawing or something. But it's implied that they were once other children, and through some magical means or from living here, whatever the case is, could be another throwback to a Hayao Miyazaki, the longer you stay here, the more you get corrupted kind of thing. Some of these runaway kids that maybe didn't make it out but have escaped being eaten turn into these gnomes. And then in the 3rd DLC, the runaway kid turns into one of these gnomes, and he is the one that brings you the sausage that you kill.
Oh no!
In the original,
Sausage
original Little Nightmares game.
I like
So,
Sausage
like,
Kid.
right? Like, but like, pump the brakes! Holy shit! Like, this was a DLC thing that somehow found a way to add like massive depth to a game that seemed like it had nowhere to grow. Right? Like,
Yeah.
I didn't see a lot of depth behind the scenes in this game. I saw it like Gino read it, like sort of like a little picture box, like a little shadow box, and it was, and that's exactly what it is, Gino. You're totally right. But this DLC, though the original game was small and the DLC was small, like the percentage increase was so cool, and they did so much with this DLC that I think games that consider releasing DLC like this should take a page out of this book. Now I'll say Little Nightmares probably had an easier path to success because they had a smaller, tighter game and could develop more behind it. But if this is a direction that DLC is going to go, I am super stoked. I think they just finished that section of the DLC in February of this year, like February 2018 or January 2018. So it just got finished. I don't think they have plans on making a fourth. I think that's it. They're done. But that was dope DLC additions to the world that I think other games should take a look at and learn from.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So how do the kids get gnomified?
We know from Little Nightmares that there is magic because the final boss, the woman, has some sort of magical powers, and if we recall, again, throwing back to the Hayao Miyazaki, one of the scenes in Spirited Away is when Sen's, or Chihiro, however you want to call her, she's got two names in that movie, she watches her parents become like so gluttonous in this place that they stumble into that they become pigs.
Yeah.
So that could be happening to the customers, like the clients that are brought onto the ship. Like, you know, they could be part of that cycle as well, part of her control. But it's possible that these gnomes become little servants of the system as well. They may have freed themselves and are now safe from being eaten, but they certainly haven't escaped the system yet. Because in a lot of ways, the gnomes serve as the ones who like throw the coal into the burners to keep the ship going and all that stuff. I don't know how they exactly get gnomified because, again, I didn't play the DLC. I just like watched it. So I didn't get a chance to explore and go into every nook and cranny like I normally do. I just like watch somebody else's playthrough of the DLC.
Okay. I mean, that's definitely a very interesting bit of depth.
Yeah, it says, I'm actually reading a bit of it. There's some implication that the gnomes were once, or they could have been children. There's like implications. Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty cool. But you specifically learn that the lady's face is super grotesque, which explains why she's wearing the mask.
Makes sense.
No, here it is. I'm reading it now. The lady captures the kid and turns him into a gnome.
Oh, okay.
So specifically, she does it.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay, that's it. She turns him into a gnome. She turns kids into gnomes, I guess.
I'm not sure what I would have liked better for the mistress. If she were grotesque and it was sort of straightforward. If it was sort of like Twilight Zone, where all the doctors are ugly and she's gorgeous. I don't know.
Sure. Well, I don't have much more to say on Little Nightmares. It was a pretty solid game, and I recommend playing it. It's not that expensive either. And I think it'll probably be in the running for our Game of the Year because it's coming out for Switch this year, and we like having multiple things to discuss for Game of the Year.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be... So, yeah, I guess it has a 2018 release date, so...
It does. There's a version coming out this year, so...
Yeah, that counts.
Final Fantasy 15 is getting a Windows port this year, so...
Hey! Now we're talking.
Devil May Cry 3 I literally just bought that before the podcast started, because the Devil May Cry series just got re-released in HD. Game of the Year.
Let the record show that Final Fantasy IX came out for the PC in the year when we played it, and I did not argue that it should be the Game of the Year.
Yeah, but I mean, Final Fantasy IX, Devil May Cry 3. I mean, come on.
Fair enough. So it is my turn to pick. I pick for our next game to play Kirby 64.
Woo! Okay.
I believe specifically Kirby the Crystal Shards?
The Crystal Shards.
Okay, yeah.
Good pick. Any Kirby gamer is a good pick. But
I just want something, the community endurance run is rapidly approaching. We have other things that are more intense. I just need to feel good. I just want to be happy.
I can't think of a larger tonal shift than Little Nightmares to Kirby the Crystal Shards.
Well, let me just say that Kirby, like the creatures in Little Nightmares, is a never-ending maw.
Maybe a more relevant transition than we give it credit for. Just eternal consumption.
All right, that was good. That was.
Kirby, everything goes into the Kirby. Where does it go? We don't know. We are all part of the Kirby.
What if that was like, is the world a simulation? No, it's just all inside of Kirby.
Yep. There's Kirby's inside Kirby. It's a horrible nightmare. They all float down here. It's like, what is it in Dragon Ball Z when Majin Buu eats people? And then inside, like, you end up stuck in some sort of thing that saps
it's like
your powers.
Prisons. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like that, but inside of Kirby. Okay, so we're going to play Kirby 64, a.k.a. Kirby the Crystal Shards, coming up next. And if you have any feedback for the episode on Little Nightmares or any other episodes, go ahead at DeepListensPod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com, and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. Okay, so thank you, Billy.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I had a great time playing Little Nightmares. I will say with honesty that I came in with lower expectations, which is probably why I enjoyed the game a lot more than I thought I would. I would say this game is definitely worth picking up. I would get it as a bundle. If you can, get it with the DLC. Try to pick it up when it's on sale. I think that would massively increase your dollars spent to value out of the game because it is a pretty short game. I think if you sit down and play through the entire game and all the DLC, it's like maybe 6 hours, like 6 or 8 hours. So know that going in. But ultimately, there's a lot of commentary. Again, as you just heard, there was 3 pretty unique readings of this game, and they all hit on pretty relevant topics and accurately depicted some of these gameplay dynamics. So I think Little Nightmares is a gem. I think you probably want to look for it on Steam or on Switch or on whatever system you have as a bundle. Get it when it's discounted. That would really, really amp up your cost to utility of the game. But it's great by itself, so you should get it and support the developers anyway.
Thank you, Pete.
Yeah, always a pleasure. I think Billy pretty much summed up what I would have had to say about Little Nightmares, so I'll just once again make a plug for Audra Lord's essay for the Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. It is a classic piece, only 11 years old, but a classic piece of coalitional and intersectional feminism.
Very cool. And thank you, listeners. Till next time, peace!